It was a hazy, moon-thin night in the summer of 1980. The hour had crept close to midnight, but Elias and Ruth still could not sleep. Pale moonlight slid through the window of the narrow room they rented on the edge of town. A low-ceilinged place with paint peeling off the walls and an old tin roof that let the rain in whenever a storm blew hard. Tonight, though, a cool breeze had come up, and somewhere out past the empty pasture, a whippoorwill called and called. And for once, the heart could find a little peace. The two of them lay close together on the thin mattress, and Ruth rested her hand on her husband's chest, her fingers still carrying the faint smell of pine sawdust and wood glue. "How long now?" she asked softly. "Before we move up to the hollow?" Elias eased himself up to sit, reached over and pushed the window open wider to let more of the night in. He looked out at the dark, took a cigarette from the pack, and set it to his lips. The lighter caught on the third try. The tip flared red, and he drew in a long, slow breath. "I've been figuring on it," he said, letting the smoke curl out into the cool air. "Once I finish this last run of stones, we go. Preacher says the end of the month falls on good weather. We'll load up and be gone before the heat sets in." Ruth shifted, turning onto her side, her voice thoughtful in the dark. "You reckon we'll make a living up there? It's awful far out." "We'll make it," he said. "And even if the money comes slow at first, that house is ours, free and clear or near about. Aunt Cora sold it to us for kin's price because I'm blood. A whole house with a yard, a porch, a kitchen of our own. No landlord banging on the door, no sharing a wall with strangers. It's half of what folks pay down here in town. Lord dropped it right in our laps." Ruth laughed quietly, the kind of laugh a woman gives when she is almost afraid to believe her own good fortune. "They say the hollow's lonesome, though. Not many souls up that way anymore. Might get quiet." "Quiet suits me fine," Elias said, and he meant it. He was a man who had never had much use for crowds. "We work for ourselves, you and me. We don't cross anybody. We don't owe anybody. Carve the stones, build the boxes, take the orders as they come. A body that's willing to work will always eat." She laid her head against his knee and could not hide the gladness in her face. "I'm just happy is all," she whispered. "All these years we've been scraping by, renting one poor room after another, never knowing when we'd be put out. Now we'll have a roof that belongs to us. I don't hardly know how to want anything more." Elias felt something soften in his chest. He put his hand on her shoulder, still cool from the night breeze, and spoke low. "Give it a few years. We'll have the shop up and running, my name over the door. A man learns this trade. He learns folks always need what we sell. There's no season doesn't have its dying in it." It was a grim thing to say out loud, and yet in that little room, it did not sound grim at all. It sounded like a promise. Elias had come up hard, harder than most. His mother had passed when he was scarcely 4, and his father had gone into the ground a year after that, killed in the shaft down at the coal works. There had been no one to take a boy but Aunt Cora, and even she had been too poor to keep him long, so he had been handed from one household to the next like a sack of seed. He had quit school young and gone to work hauling and lifting until an old stonecutter took him on and taught him to letter a name into granite so it would last 100 years. From there, it was a short step to the coffins. It was work that most men shied from, but it had fed him, and now it would build him a home. Ruth had come up the same way, poor as a church mouse, her daddy dead before she could walk, and her mama selling fish at the market to keep them. She had left school to help, then drifted from one hard job to another until the two of them met through a woman who knew them both and thought they'd suit. And they had. In all their lean years together, they had never once raised their voices at each other. There had never been anything to fight over but hard times. And hard times they bore side by side. "When we're settled," Ruth said drowsily, "and if the Lord sees fit to bless us with a child, boy or girl, it don't matter which, I only pray it won't have to come up the way we did, cold and hungry and passed around."
"It won't," Elias said. "I'll see to that."
He crushed out the cigarette against the sill and lay back down beside her, and for a while, neither of them spoke. Outside, the whippoorwill fell silent at last, and the moon slid behind a rag of cloud, and the room went dark as the inside of a closed box. He closed his eyes and let himself picture it the way a man will on the eve of a change. The cabin up in Coldwater Hollow, the mountains folded close around it, the creek running cold over the stones, his name lettered on a board above the door. He did not know, lying there, that the house Aunt Cora had given him would be the first thing he ever truly owned, and also the place where he would lose every last thing he had. He only knew that in the morning they would begin to pack, and that tomorrow, at long last, they were going home. The morning they left town, the sky came up white and merciless, and by the time the sun stood straight overhead, there was no shade left anywhere on the road. Elias drove the truck with the windows down, though it did no good, the air outside being no cooler than the air within. In the bed behind him rode the last of their belongings, along with 2 crates of finished grave markers bound for a family up past the hollow, and a stack of raw coffin boards lashed down with rope so they would not shift on the turns. Ruth had gone ahead earlier that morning with a neighbor, making the same trip carrying what she could hold in her lap so that she might reach the house first and have it swept and ready before the heavy things arrived. The mountain road climbed in long, slow bends, the gravel giving way here and there to bare red clay that the truck's tires chewed into dust. Heat rose off the ground in a shimmer, so that the trees at the roadside seemed to waver like something seen through water. Elias's shirt stuck to his back. He kept one arm out the window, tapping the door in time with nothing, trying not to think how far there still was to go, nor how many more times that engine could climb a grade like this one before it gave out on him for good. The engine had begun to labor on the last rise, coughing and complaining like an old dog run further than its legs would allow. And Elias, cursing under his breath, was glad to see a store appear at the bend ahead, set back beneath the shade of an old white oak. A hand-lettered board hung crooked above the porch, its paint long faded to a ghost of blue. He eased the truck off onto the gravel apron and cut the engine, and the sudden quiet rang in his ears. He climbed down, pulled the sweat-soaked hat from his head, and fanned himself with it as he crossed toward the porch. "Whatever it is that's cooking out here," he muttered to no one, "it's cooking me along with it." The woman who kept the store was old and thin, her gray hair pinned back in a knot, and she was wiping down the counter with a rag gone yellow from years of use. She looked up at the sound of his boots on the boards and gave him a small nod of greeting. Elias pulled out a chair and sat, his knees aching from the drive. "Get you a cold drink?" she asked, and he told her yes, anything wet would do. His throat felt scorched clean through. She went to a big glass jar on the shelf, drew out lemons steeped with sugar and a sprig of something green, and poured him a tall glass over chipped ice. He drank near half of it in one go and let out a long breath, feeling the coolness spread down into his chest. "You moving in or moving through?" she asked, resting her forearms on the counter. "Haven't seen your face before." "Moving in, ma'am," he said. "Bought a place up past the bend in the hollow. Belonged to my aunt." She smiled with something like approval. "A young man with a house of his own is a young man the Lord's smiled on," she said. "Not many your age can say the same these days." Elias only nodded, turning the cool glass in his hands, his eyes drifting toward the open doorway and the white glare of the road beyond. He was in no hurry to climb back into that oven of a truck, and the old woman did not seem to mind the company. She asked after his people, and he told her a little, that his folks had passed when he was small, that he had learned the stone-cutting trade off an old man in town, that he and his wife meant to open a shop up in the hollow once they were settled. She listened with the patience of someone who had heard 100 such stories and was glad to hear one more. For a while, there was only the creak of the ceiling fan overhead,
turning too slow to do much good, and the drone of cicadas rising and falling somewhere out past the porch.
Then, without warning, the cicadas stopped. It was not a fading away, the kind of hush that comes when a cloud passes or the wind shifts. It happened all at once, as though someone had reached out and shut a door on the sound. Elias felt it before he understood it, a strange pressure behind his ears, the way the air goes still and heavy right before a hard rain. Except there was not a cloud anywhere in that white sky. He set the glass down slowly on the counter. The old woman had gone still too. She was looking past him out through the doorway, her rag forgotten in her hand. Elias turned in his chair to follow her gaze. Down the road, where a narrow dirt track came in from among the trees, figures had begun to appear, moving slow and close together, and something about the shape of them, something about the silence that clung to them like a second skin, made the hair rise along his arms before his mind had even settled on what he was looking at. At the front walked someone dressed head to foot in white, and the noon light lay so strangely on that white cloth that for one dizzy instant he could not tell if he was looking at a person walking or something merely drifting a few inches above the ground. He set his glass down without meaning to, the ice rattling against the sides. Behind him, he heard the old woman's rags slip from her fingers and land soft upon the counter, and neither one of them said a word. They came on slow, and as they drew nearer, Elias saw there was no music in it at all. No hymn, no drum, no bell, just the shuffle of feet on the hot gravel and the low creak of wood. 4 young men in dark, ill-fitting suits carried the coffin between them on their shoulders, its lid a pale, unfinished pine that had not yet been given a coat of stain, as though it had been built in haste. Behind them came a small knot of mourners, 5 or 6 women in faded black, one with a handkerchief pressed hard against her mouth, another so unsteady on her feet that a boy walked close beside her with a hand at her elbow, ready to catch her if her knees gave. At the very front of the procession, just ahead of the coffin, walked a young woman in a plain white dress, her dark hair loose down her back, holding out before her in both hands a small framed photograph. Not a wedding Elias thought at first, watching from the porch step for something in the white cloth, had caught his eye, and his mind had reached for the nearest word it knew. But no bride walked with her head bowed so, and no groom's family wept behind her like that. He understood his mistake almost as soon as he had made it, and a strange chill passed over him despite the heat, quick and light as a hand laid on the back of his neck. "Lord, have mercy," Miss Hetty murmured beside him, and she made the sign of the cross over her chest, a thing Elias had not once seen her do in the half hour he'd sat in her store. "Who is it?" he asked low. "Girl from over the far side of the ridge," she said. "Died a few days back. Car went off the switchback road at Miller's Curve, they say, hit head on with a coal truck coming the other way. Wasn't hardly enough left of her to know her by her own face. 19 years old. Only child her daddy had." The procession passed close by the store, close enough that Elias could hear the women's low weeping, thin and worn out, the kind of crying that has already gone on too long to have much strength left in it. And there was no wailing, no crying out to heaven the way he had seen at other funerals, only that terrible hush, as though grief itself had been muffled down to a whisper out of respect for something listening close by. As the coffin passed, the wind stirred the pall draped over it, and for one instant, the veil came loose enough that Elias caught sight of the small, oval photograph the young woman at the front was carrying, tipped just enough to catch the light. He saw, for no more than a heartbeat, a face of striking, almost unbearable prettiness. Dark eyes, a soft mouth, skin pale as the inside of a shell. "Shame," he heard himself murmur half under his breath, watching the procession pull away down the road. Pretty as that, and dead so young. Man'd be a fool not to have married a girl like that had he got the chance before she went. He meant nothing hard by it. It was only the kind of loose, careless thing men say when the heat has gotten into their heads and their tongues run ahead of their sense. But the words had no sooner left him than Miss Hetty's hand closed hard around his wrist, her grip startlingly strong for a woman her age.
"Don't you say such things," she hissed, her eyes wide and fixed on him. "Not about the dead, and not about a girl gone that way. A young woman taken before her time, taken cruel and sudden like that. Her spirit don't rest easy. Talk sweet on a soul like that and she'll hear you. She'll remember your face."
Elias almost laughed, but something in the old woman's face stopped him. "I was only joking, ma'am," he said. "Meant no disrespect. Joking don't matter to the dead," she said, and released his arm, though her hand trembled faintly as she drew it back. "They don't hear the joke. They only hear the words." He looked away from her down the road where the procession had gone, meaning to shake off the strange weight that had settled over him. And it was then that he saw her. The young woman in white had fallen back from the head of the line, drifting, it seemed, without any effort of walking at all, until she stood almost alone at the rear of the procession, some good distance behind the others. And as Elias watched, she turned, slowly and all the way around, so that she faced back up the road toward the store, toward him, though there was no reason on earth she should have known he was looking. Her eyes were open, and they were white all the way across, white as the coffin lid, with no color in them at all. One hand lifted from her side fingers, pale and long, and rose into the air, not waving exactly, but reaching the way a person reaches for something they cannot quite believe is out of arm's length. Elias's stomach dropped. He blinked hard once, and in the space of that single blink, the entire procession was gone. Not turned a corner, not passed behind the trees, simply gone. The road lying empty and white and shimmering with heat, as though nothing at all had walked down it in the last quarter hour. Beside him, the ice in his abandoned glass had melted down to nothing. He did not speak of what he had seen. Not to Ruth, not to anyone. By the time he reached the hollow that evening, the sky had gone gold and heavy over the ridgeline, and the strangeness of the noon hour had already begun to feel like something he had dreamed on too little sleep and too much heat. He told himself that was all it had been. A trick of the light, a fool's mind playing tricks after a long, hard drive. The house stood waiting for him at the end of the dirt track, small and square, its boards silvered with age, its tin roof catching the last of the sun in a dull orange sheen. Ruth was on the porch when he pulled up, broom still in hand, her hair damp with the sweat of a long day's cleaning. And she came down the steps to meet him with a smile that pushed every dark thought clean out of his head. "We got a home, Mr. Crane," she said, and he laughed for the first time since noon and carried her over the threshold as though they had only just wed. That first evening they ate cold biscuits on the porch steps, too tired to cook, watching the light fade slow behind the far ridge, and Ruth bowed her head before they ate and gave thanks as she always did, for the roof, for the food, however plain, for the hands that had built the life they now stood inside of. Elias bowed his head along with her, out of habit and love, though his own faith ran thinner than hers, and always had. He believed in what a man could build with his hands. Ruth believed in something further off and further up, and it had never once come between them. The weeks that followed passed easier than either of them had dared to hope. Elias cleared a corner of the yard and raised a lean-to shed for his tools, the granite blocks and coffin boards stacked neat beneath its roof. And soon enough, word had gotten around the hollow that a stone cutter had settled in, and the orders began to trickle his way. Ruth kept the house planted a small garden of beans and tomatoes in the softer soil behind the kitchen, and on Sunday mornings, the two of them walked the 1.5 miles down to the little white church that sat at the crossroads, its steeple leaning very slightly to the east, the way an old man leans on a cane. Brother Amos preached there, a broad, slow-spoken man with big hands and a voice that never once had to rise to fill the room. He welcomed the young couple warmly the first Sunday they came, shook Elias's hand with both of his own, and told Ruth that any woman who kept a household as neat as hers spoke of must surely keep a heart the same way. Ruth blushed and thanked him, and after that, they were fixtures in the third pew from the front, rain or shine.
"It's a good thing you've done coming up here," Brother Amos told them one evening when he had walked out to see the new place for himself and sat with them on the porch as the fireflies rose up out of the grass. This hollow's had its share of trouble over the years, folks moving out more than moving in. Does my heart good to see young life come back to it. Elias only nodded and said that he hoped the trade would hold, and Amos assured him it would, so long as the Lord kept lending breath to the living and taking it from the dying, which he had shown no sign yet of stopping. At night, lying together beneath the low ceiling, with the window cracked to let in the cool mountain air, Ruth would sometimes rest her hand low on her stomach and say nothing at all, only smile a private, hopeful smile that Elias had come to understand without needing words for it. "Give it time," he told her once, brushing a strand of hair back from her face. "We've got nothing but time now." It seemed in those first weeks that every promise made in that cramped rented room back in town had begun one by one to come due. The house held. The work came steady. The evenings were sweet and slow, and the memory of that strange noon on the road, the silent procession, the white eyes turning back toward him, sank down deeper each day beneath the ordinary business of living, until Elias could go whole days without it once crossing his mind. There was only the one thing that never quite settled right with him, though he could not have said why it troubled him at all. Just beyond the low fence that marked the edge of their property stood another house, older and smaller than their own, its windows boarded, its yard gone wild with chicory and blackberry canes grown up over the porch steps. No one lived there. No one, so far as Elias could learn, had lived there in years. Ruth asked Miss Hetty about it once on a trip down to the store for salt and coffee, and the old woman only said that it had belonged to a family who'd moved on some time back, and that folks around the hollow generally left it be. It sat there through all of August, silent and empty, gathering dust behind its shuttered windows, no different from 100 other abandoned places scattered through those hills. Until the rain came on the 49th day since they had moved in, and everything in that quiet, contented life began very slowly to change. The rain came on sudden that afternoon, the way storms do in the mountains, with no more warning than a darkening at the edge of the sky and a change in the smell of the air. By 2 o'clock, the light outside had gone the color of a day-old bruise, and by 1:30, the first drops were hammering the tin roof hard enough that Ruth had to raise her voice to be heard over it from one room to the next. Elias was out at the shed when it started working a length of granite with slow, careful strokes of the chisel, and he did not come in until the worst of it had passed. His shirt soaked through, despite the overhang, his boots caked with red mud to the ankle. Ruth had supper near ready by then, and she met him at the door with a towel and a look on her face he could not quite name. Something caught between curiosity and unease. "Elias," she said, "come look at this a minute." She led him to the kitchen window, the glass still runneled with rain, and pointed across the fence line to the old house next door. Elias followed her finger and felt something turn over slow in his chest. There was someone on the porch. A young woman stood at the edge of the boarded-up house, unhurried, entirely unbothered by the rain, still coming down in sheets around her, sweeping water off the porch boards with slow, even strokes of a broom, as calm as if it were the driest afternoon in July. Her hair hung loose and heavy down her back, plastered dark against her white dress by the wet, and even at that distance, through the streaked glass and the gray curtain of rain, Elias could see that she never once looked up, never once seemed to notice or mind the storm soaking her through to the skin. "Who is that?" he asked, and his own voice sounded strange to him, thinner than he meant it. "I don't know," Ruth said. "I've been watching near 10 minutes now. She just come up out of nowhere. Wasn't a soul there this morning, Elias. I'd swear it on the book. And look,
She doesn't have anything with her. No wagon, no boxes, no bags. Just herself and that broom.
Maybe kin of the folks that used to live there, Elias offered, though even as he said it, the words felt thin and unconvincing in his own mouth. Come to look the place over. Fix it up, maybe. In this rain, Ruth said doubtfully. Sweeping a porch in a rain like this? Neither of them had an answer for that, and they stood together at the window a while longer, watching the pale, patient figure move back and forth along the porch boards, her motion slow and unhurried as something underwater. There was no lamp lit inside the house behind her. No smoke rose from its chimney, and no sound reached them from that direction at all. Not even the ordinary creak of porch boards under a body's weight, though those same boards had groaned and complained under every step Elias had ever taken near that house himself. When the wind gusted hard enough to rattle the loose tin over one broken window, the woman did not flinch, did not so much as glance toward the sound, and something in that stillness unsettled him more than any flinching would have. By supper time, the rain had eased to a drizzle, and when Ruth looked again, the porch across the fence stood empty, the woman gone as quietly as she had come, leaving behind no track in the mud that either of them could later swear to having seen. They ate supper mostly in silence, both of them turning the strange sight over in their minds without quite finding words to share it. Toward the meal's end, Ruth spoke again, her voice lower now, uncertain. There's something else, she said. Earlier, before you came in from the shed, I was carrying the wash basin out back, and I looked over quick without thinking on it, and she was standing right at the fence line, just standing there, looking this way, straight at our house. When I went to call out, ask if she needed anything, she turned around and went back inside quick as anything. Didn't make a sound. Elias set down his fork. Probably shy, is all he said, though the words did little to settle the unease sitting cold in his own stomach. Living alone out here, a young woman's bound to be skittish of new neighbors. Ruth nodded slowly, but he could see she was not convinced, and truth told, neither was he. Full dark had fallen by the time they finished the dishes. The rain gone now to nothing but a light patter against the tin, and the two of them sat a while on the porch in the cool, washed air, watching the fireflies come up out of the wet grass one by one. The house across the fence sat dark and silent, no different, Elias told himself, than it had sat all through August. They had just begun to speak of turning in for the night when the knock came at the door. 3 soft raps, deliberate and even, the sound carrying strangely clear through the damp night air. Elias and Ruth looked at each other across the porch, neither one moving for a long moment, both of them thinking, though neither said it aloud, that it was a late hour for any visitor, and that no one they knew in the hollow was in the habit of calling after dark. Elias rose slowly from his chair, wiped his palms on his trousers, and crossed to the door. He opened the door to find the young woman from across the fence standing on the bottom step, a small covered basket held against her middle with both arms. Up close in the yellow spill of lamplight from the front room, Elias could see her plainly for the first time, and something in him went briefly, foolishly still at the sight of her. She could not have been past 20. Her hair, still faintly damp from the day's rain, hung loose and dark past her shoulders, and her eyes were a deep, quiet brown, set in a face too finely made for a girl living alone in a boarded-up house at the edge of nowhere. Evening, she said, and her voice was soft, careful, each word set down like something that might break if handled rough. I'm sorry to come calling so late. I'm your neighbor, just there through the trees. My name's Delilah. Behind him, Ruth had risen from her chair and come to stand at his shoulder, her earlier unease folded away now behind the plain good manners she had been raised on. Evening to you too, honey, she said warm. Come in out of the night air, won't you? Delilah shook her head gentle. I won't trouble you long. I only wanted to bring something over by way of a proper introduction. She lifted the lid of the basket to show a still warm pan of cornbread wrapped in cloth.
I don't have much, but I do like to bake, and it seemed a poor thing to move in next to good neighbors without so much as a how do you do.
That's kindly of you, Ruth said, taking the basket with real gladness. You're too good. Come sit with us a spell at least. We were just fixing to have coffee.
There was a pause, then brief but noticeable, before Delilah answered.
I don't sleep well most nights, she said at last. I find I do better keeping to myself after dark. But I thank you all the same.
Elias found himself studying her in the lamplight, unable quite to look away.
Her skin was pale in a way that seemed to catch and hold the light, rather than reflect it smooth and cool-looking, like something carved rather than born. And though he told himself it was only the poor light playing tricks, he could not shake the notion that her eyes, fixed steady on his own, did not carry quite the same shine that Ruth's did, or his own would have standing in that same lamp glow.
You live alone over there? Ruth asked, settling the basket on the little table by the door.
Yes, ma'am. My people passed on some years back. I keep to myself mostly. Take in a bit of mending, a little baking here and there, whatever pays.
Well, Ruth said, if you're ever in want of company or extra work, you're welcome here any evening. Lord knows Elias and I have more mending and paperwork than the two of us can rightly keep up with, what with the shop taking so much of his time.
A faint smile touched the corner of Delilah's mouth,
there and gone so quickly that Elias could not afterward be certain he had seen it at all. I'd be glad of the work, she said, if it's no trouble.
None at all, Ruth answered.
Evenings suit you best, you said.
Evenings suit me best,
Delilah agreed, and something in the plain repetition of the words made the hair rise faintly on the back of Elias's neck, though he could not have said why.
She took her leave soon after, thanking them once more for their kindness.
And Elias watched from the porch as she crossed the wet grass toward the gap in the fence, moving with a strange gliding evenness, her bare feet seeming scarcely to disturb the tall, rain-heavy grass at all. She did not look back. From that evening on, Delilah came most nights after supper, letting herself through the gap in the fence just as the last light was draining out of the sky, and settled in with Ruth at the low table by the fire to help with the mending and the paperwork that came with Elias's trade, folding orders, copying figures into the ledger in a small, careful hand. Ruth took a liking to her quickly, glad of another woman's company in a place so short on neighbors and Elias.
Working near them at his bench, found his eyes drifting more often than he liked to admit toward the pale, bent head across the room. Once reaching past her for a spool of thread, his hand brushed hers by accident, and he felt in that briefest touch a coldness that startled him. The kind of cold a stone holds long after the sun has gone down. The kind of cold that has nothing to do with a house that is too poor to heat or a night that has turned chill. Delilah did not seem to notice, or if she did, she gave no sign of it, only continued folding the paper in her lap with the same slow, even patience she brought to everything she did.
Ruth, busy with her own stitching, remarked once in an idle way that the girl must run cold-blooded, the way some folks simply did, and thought no more of it. But Elias found the thought lodged somewhere in him, and would not easily shake it loose.
It was full dark, past 9. On the third such evening, the three of them bent over their work in the low lamplight, when a sound rose up outside in the yard. A low, wet snuffling, followed by the soft, deliberate pad of paws crossing the porch boards. Ruth looked up first. "Elias," she said, her needle going still in her hand. "There's something at the door."
Elias set down his chisel and crossed to the door, and no sooner had he lifted the latch than a black shape shoved past his leg and into the room, low and fast claws skittering on the floorboards. It was a hound, or had been one once, a big, rangy animal gone half wild, its coat matted and dark with rain, its ribs showing plain beneath the wet fur. It came to a stop just inside the threshold, and there it froze entirely still, every muscle in its body drawn taut as wire, its head lowered, its lips already curling back from its teeth. Elias had no more than a second to register the strangeness of it. A dog bursting into a house it had never set foot in, before he understood what had stopped the animal cold. It was staring at Delilah, not at Ruth seated closer to the door, not at Elias himself still standing with his hand on the latch. The hound's eyes wet and rolling wide with something that looked less like ordinary fright and more like pure animal horror were fixed entirely on the pale, still figure seated at the low table, needle poised motionless above the cloth in her lap. A sound built low in the animal's throat, not quite a growl, not quite a whine, but something caught uneasily between the two. And then it broke into a full, savage snarl, all its hackles standing straight up along its spine. Ruth gasped and drew back in her chair, her hand flying to her chest. "Elias, get it out," she said, her voice gone thin with alarm. He grabbed the broom that leaned by the hearth and stepped forward, meaning to drive the animal back out into the yard. But the dog paid him no mind at all, would not so much as glance his way. Its whole attention pinned on Delilah, as though nothing else in the room existed. It began to bark, hard and frantic, backing a step and then another, its claws scrabbling for purchase on the wood floor, and still it did not take its eyes from her. Through all of it, Delilah did not move. She sat exactly as she had before the hound burst in her hands, folded loose in her lap, her face composed into an expression of mild, distant patience, as though the animal's terror were a small and rather tedious inconvenience, no more troubling to her than a fly buzzing at a window pane. She did not flinch at the barking. She did not draw back. She only watched the dog with those calm, dark eyes, and something in that stillness, that utter absence of any ordinary fear, struck Elias as far more unnatural than the animal's wild behavior. "Poor thing must be sick," Delilah said at last, her voice even and unbothered. "Or scared of strangers. I don't believe he means any harm." The hound gave one last ragged burst of barking, a sound that cracked at the end into something almost like a cry. And then all at once, its nerve broke entirely. It spun on its haunches and bolted back out through the still open door off the porch and into the dark yard beyond, its claws throwing up clots of wet earth as it went. And within seconds, the sound of it had faded away entirely into the trees, leaving behind only a ragged, muddy print or two on the floorboards, and a silence that seemed to ring louder than the barking had. Ruth let out a shaky breath, one hand still pressed flat against her chest. "Lord, that gave me a fright," she said. "Never seen a dog carry on so in all my life. Acted like it had seen the devil himself standing in the room." "I'm sorry," Delilah said softly, turning back to her mending as though nothing at all had happened. "I don't know what got into him. Animals take strange notions sometimes. My mother always said a dog will bark at a stranger's smell long before it barks at a stranger's face." Ruth managed a small, uncertain laugh and busied herself smoothing the front of her dress, glancing once more toward the open door, as if she expected the creature to come tearing back through it. "Well, whatever ailed him, I hope he's found his way home to wherever he belongs. Can't imagine what a body's meant to do with a dog gone that wild." Elias said nothing. He crossed to the door once more, if only to satisfy himself that the yard beyond truly stood empty, and stood a long moment in the doorway with the cool night air moving past him, listening. There was no sound out there now, not even the ordinary creak of insects that usually rose up from the grass after a rain. The muddy prints on the floorboards behind him seemed in that strange quiet like the only proof that any of it had happened at all. He closed the door and latched it and returned to his bench, but he found he could not settle back into his work as easily as before. His hands moved over the wood out of long habit alone, while his mind kept circling back again and again to the dog's eyes and the particular unreasoning terror fixed so precisely on the one still calm figure in the room. He was not by nature a man given to superstition, He had told Miss Hetty as much weeks before and meant it, and yet something in that animal's raw horror had lodged itself in him now, like a splinter too deep to work free. His eyes kept drifting, almost against his will, toward Delilah's bowed head, the slow, patient movement of her hands over the cloth. And for the first time since that first evening at the fence, he found himself looking at her not merely with curiosity, but with something else entirely. Something he did not yet have a name for, and would not have wanted one for had he known what it truly was. The days that followed folded into one another with a sameness that Elias would later be unable to properly account for. So gradual was the change that crept over him, so easy to mistake at first for nothing more than a man's ordinary appreciation of a pretty face. He told himself that much, at least in those early weeks, that there was no harm in looking, that a married man's eye might wander without his heart ever once following it. But look, he did, and more than he had any right to. He began to notice small things about Delilah that he told himself he had no business noticing. The particular grace of her wrist as she folded a length of cloth. The way lamplight seemed to gather and pool along her collarbone when she bent low over her work. The stillness of her, so unlike Ruth's easy, restless warmth, and how that very stillness had begun without his quite meaning it to draw his eye again and again across the room. He began, too, to measure his wife against her, though he was ashamed of the habit even as he indulged it. Ruth was warm where Delilah was cool. Ruth laughed loud and often, a good, honest laugh that filled up whatever room she stood in, while Delilah's smiles, when they came at all, were small and fleeting things, gone almost before they had fully arrived, and somehow all the more precious to Elias for their scarcity. Ruth's hands were rough from years of hard work, chapped at the knuckles, quick and capable. Delilah's hands were pale and unmarked, moving over cloth and paper with a slow, deliberate elegance that seemed to his increasingly clouded eye like something out of a finer world than the one he had been born into. He hated himself a little in the quiet hours before sleep for thinking such thoughts about the woman who had stood by him through every lean and hungry year of his life, who had shared his rented rooms and his empty pockets without once complaining, who prayed each night for a child he was no longer certain he still wanted, with the same simple faith he had once loved in her. And yet the thoughts came anyway, unbidden, and would not be driven off, returning again each evening the moment Delilah's slight figure appeared at the gap in the fence. One afternoon, on a trip down to the dry goods store in town for nails and glue, he found himself lingering at a bolt of pale blue silk, laid out on the counter, fine and shimmering, entirely unlike anything either he or Ruth could rightly afford. He bought a length of it before he had fully decided paying with money that should have gone toward the shop, and carried it home, hidden beneath the seat of the truck, like a man smuggling contraband. He waited for an evening when Ruth had gone early to bed, worn out from a long day at the washtub, and found Delilah alone on the porch step, watching the fireflies rise up out of the dark grass. "I saw this and thought of you," he said, holding the folded cloth out to her, his voice rougher than he intended, thick with a feeling he did not care to examine too closely. Delilah looked at the silk a long moment before taking it from his hands, her fingers brushing his, cool as always, lingering there, perhaps a heartbeat longer than was strictly necessary. "That's very kind," she said softly. "You didn't need to trouble yourself." "I wanted to," he said, and the words felt dangerous even as he spoke them, an admission he had not meant to make. She looked up at him then, and in the near dark, her eyes seemed to hold something he could not name, an expression neither warm nor cold, but patient, watchful, the way a woman looks at a man she has already decided the ending of. "Thank you, Elias," she said, and the sound of his own given name in her mouth, soft and unhurried, struck him somewhere low in the chest, a small, sweet ache he had not felt in longer than he cared to admit. From that evening forward, he found new reasons to linger after the day's work was done. He would offer to walk Delilah partway home through the trees, though her house stood no more than a stone's throw beyond the fence. He would find excuses to remain at his bench past the hour he usually quit, watching from beneath lowered lashes the slow, graceful movements of her hands as she worked alongside Ruth in the lamplight. He began to notice and to resent every ordinary interruption.
Ruth calling him in to supper, a customer arriving to collect an order. Anything that pulled his attention away from the quiet, private study he had made of the woman across the room. He told himself still, even then, that it was nothing. That a man might admire a thing without wanting to possess it. But the lie grew thinner and harder to hold with each passing evening. And some nights, lying beside Ruth in the dark, listening to her steady, trusting breath, he would find his own mind had already wandered next door, imagining what it might be like to sit beside that pale, still figure, with no wife waiting in the next room, no vows standing between them. Nothing at all to hold him back.
He did not yet understand what he was becoming. He only knew that some hunger in him long dormant had woken, and that it would not easily be put back to sleep. He thought of the noon burial, sometimes, still in odd, unguarded moments, the pale face in that oval photograph, the eyes gone white as bone, and told himself the resemblance he sometimes fancied he saw was nothing more than a trick of grief and memory.
The kind of foolishness a man's mind will manufacture when it has already decided what it wants to believe.
It was well past midnight when Elias woke from a thin, restless sleep, his mouth dry, his stomach uneasy from the heavy supper he had eaten too fast. Ruth slept on beside him, turned away, her breathing slow and even, undisturbed by whatever had pulled him up out of his own rest. He lay still a moment, staring at the dark ceiling, and found his thoughts already drifting as they had taken to doing more often lately, toward the small house across the fence and the pale,
still figure who kept to it after dark.
He rose as quietly as he could manage, pulling on his trousers in the dark, telling himself he meant only to walk out to the privy and back, through some quieter, more honest part of him already suspected otherwise. The night outside was close, and still no moon to speak of. Only a thin scatter of stars showing through a haze that had settled low over the hollow. He crossed the yard barefoot, the grass cool and damp beneath his feet, and had nearly reached the fence line when a sound stopped him, faint and rhythmic, coming from somewhere off past the tree line behind Delilah's house. Water moving. The particular soft splash of someone bathing in the creek that ran along the back of both properties, hidden from the house by a thick stand of alder and blackberry cane. He told himself he ought to turn around then, that a decent man, a married man, had no earthly business creeping towards such a sound in the dead of night. And yet, his feet did not turn. They carried him instead, slow and quiet, as a man walking in his sleep, toward the gap in the brush where the sound was coming from. Some low and shameful curiosity pulling harder on him than any sense of what was right. He knew he ought to turn back. Every plain notion of decency in him said so plain and clear as a bell. And yet his feet carried him instead toward the sound, slow and quiet, until he stood at the edge of the tree line, looking down through a gap in the brush at the pale, moving shape below.
Delilah stood waist deep in the black water, her back to him, her wet hair clinging in dark ropes down her spine.
And even in that poor, starless light, there was something about the sight of her, something too still, too composed for a woman who believed herself alone, that struck Elias as more unsettling than anything the darkness alone could account for. He should have looked away. He told himself so even as he stood rooted to the spot, his heart going hard and unsteady in his chest, some tangled knot of shame and longing holding him fast to the ground.
Then, without turning, without any sound to warn him she had noticed him at all, Delilah spoke.
"You're not much for coming closer, are you?" she said, her voice carrying easy and unhurried across the water,
as though she had known all along exactly where he stood. Elias froze, his breath caught somewhere high in his throat. "I didn't mean to," he started, though the lie died half-formed on his tongue, useless against the plain fact of where he stood and what he had been doing. She turned, then slow, unhurried, the black water sheeting off her pale shoulders. And though the dark hid more than it revealed, Elias found he could not make himself look away, could not summon whatever ordinary decency should have turned his feet back toward the house. "I'm not afraid of the dark," Delilah said, her eyes finding his easily across the distance, as though the poor light troubled her not at all. "Not afraid of whatever's out there in these woods either, if there's anything out there at all. The only thing that ever frightens me, Elias Crane, is a man who looks and never once finds the courage to come closer." The words landed in him like a struck match dropped into dry brush. He stood a long moment, caught between the plain shape of his own life, the wife sleeping, trusting in the house behind him, the vows he had spoken before God and witnesses, and the low, insistent pull of something he did not have a name for and did not want one. In the end, it was the distant call of a whippoorwill, sudden and startling in the stillness, that broke whatever held him there. He stepped back from the gap in the brush, his heart hammering, and without a word, he turned and made his way back through the wet grass toward the house, not once looking behind him, though he could feel her eyes on his back the whole way, steady and unbothered until the door had closed safely behind him. He did not sleep again that night. He lay beside Ruth in the dark, her warm, familiar shape curled unknowing against his side, and stared up at the low ceiling while Delilah's words turned over and over in his mind, unwilling to be set down. "I'm not afraid of the dark. The only thing that frightens me is a man who looks and never comes closer." Somewhere near dawn, exhausted past the point of resistance, he finally drifted into a shallow, troubled sleep. And even there, her voice followed him, low and patient, promising something he was already, God help him, beginning to want more than he had ever wanted anything in his life. When he rose again a few short hours later, heavy-eyed and hollow, Ruth asked him gently if he had slept poorly, and he told her only that the heat had kept him restless, and could not quite meet her eyes as he said it. There came a night not long after that Elias would afterward try hard not to remember, and could never quite manage to forget. A night when want finally overpowered every last scrap of conscience left in him, when he rose again from beside his sleeping wife and crossed the dark yard not by accident, but by choice, and did not return until the sky had begun its first pale graying toward dawn. He told himself, climbing back into bed beside Ruth's warm, unknowing back, that it would be the only time. He told himself a great many things that night, none of which turned out to be true. It was not the only time. Within a fortnight, it had become a habit he no longer fully tried to resist 3 nights out of 5, sometimes 4. The low creak of the door, the wet grass underfoot, the long walk home again before first light. He grew practiced at the lie of it, the easy excuse of a restless stomach or a poor night's sleep. And Ruth, trusting him as she always had, trusting him as she had every single day of their marriage, asked few questions and believed the answers she was given. But a woman who loves a man closely enough will come in time to know the shape of him even in the dark, the particular way he breathes when he is truly asleep, and the different way he breathes when he is only pretending to be. And something in Ruth, some old and wordless instinct, had begun keeping its own quiet counsel even before her waking mind caught up to it. It was a Tuesday evening, the wash still damp on the line, when she first noticed the smell. She had gone to fold his shirt from the day before, the one he had worn to town and back, and as she lifted it to her face out of long habit, some part of her checking without thinking for the good familiar smell of him, sawdust and tobacco,
and the clean sweat of honest work, she caught instead a thread of something else laid faintly over it. Something sweet and cool, almost like rainwater, almost like the scent of wildflowers grown up wild along a creek bank. A smell she did not recognize on her husband, and yet a smell she felt with a small, sick lurch low in her stomach that she had smelled before, drifting off Delilah's hair on the evenings the girl sat close beside her at the mending table. She stood very still for a long moment, the shirt held loose in her hands, and told herself it was nothing. That sense carried easy on a warm night, that the girl had likely brushed past him in passing, that there was 100 plain, harmless explanations for such a small thing. And yet the thought once planted would not be so easily uprooted. She began, without quite deciding, to watch her husband more closely. She noticed how his eyes drifted in the evenings toward the low table where Delilah sat, bent over her mending, lingering there a beat longer than courtesy required. She noticed how he had stopped teasing her the way he once had, stopped pulling her onto his lap after supper with some foolish joke about the two of them building an empire out of gravestones and coffin wood. She noticed the tired, faraway look that had settled behind his eyes. A look she had first taken for the ordinary weariness of hard work and had only lately begun to wonder if it meant something else entirely. She said nothing of any of it, not yet. She was not a woman given to accusation without cause, and some stubborn, hopeful part of her still wanted badly to believe there was an innocent answer waiting just beneath the surface, if only she looked hard enough to find it. She prayed on it instead, kneeling alone some mornings after Elias had already gone out to the shed, asking the Lord plainly to settle the uneasy feeling in her chest one way or the other, so that she might know what to do with it. She thought sometimes in those quiet mornings of all the hard years they had already come through together. The cold, rented rooms, the empty pockets, the two of them holding fast to one another when there had been little else to hold on to. And it seemed to her a cruelty almost past bearing that such a thing might now be unraveling in a house she had once believed would finally keep them safe. The answer she was praying for did not come gently. It came instead on a night not long after, when Elias rose once more from their bed, believing her fast asleep, and Ruth lying still and silent in the dark, with her back turned to him, her eyes wide open, felt the mattress shift as he eased himself up, heard the soft, careful click of the latch, and understood in that moment, with a clarity that felt almost like relief after so many weeks of doubting her own senses, that she was not imagining any of it. She lay still a while longer, giving him time enough to be well clear of the house, her heart beating hard and slow and cold in her chest. Outside, somewhere past the fence, she thought she heard a door ease shut soft and careful, and the small sound settled whatever last doubt remained in her. Then she rose too and reached for her shawl and resolved before another hour had passed to see with her own eyes exactly where her husband went in the dead of night and exactly what waited for him there. Ruth crossed the yard in her bare feet, keeping low along the fence line where the shadows lay thickest. Her heart beating so hard, she felt sure it must be audible in the still night air. The grass was cold and wet beneath her, soaking the hem of her nightdress, but she scarcely noticed, all her attention fixed on the faint yellow glow of lamplight seeping through the gap in the boarded window of the house next door. Some part of her even then still hoped to find an innocent explanation waiting on the other side of that light, some small mercy that would let her turn around and go back to bed and never have to know for certain what she had already half guessed. She reached the porch and stood a long moment at the edge of it, gathering whatever courage she had left before she crept close enough to press her eye to the narrow crack between the boards. What she saw inside stopped whatever breath remained in her chest. Elias stood just inside the room, his shirt already discarded over the back of a chair, and Delilah stood before him with no more shame in her bearing than a woman standing in her own kitchen, her hand resting easy against his jaw, drawing him toward her with a slow, deliberate patience, as though she had done this 100 times before and expected to do it 100 times again.
Ruth did not remember deciding to move.
One moment she was crouched at the window, and the next she was standing in the open doorway, her hand still gripping the frame, her voice tearing out of her before her mind had caught up to what her body had already done.
"So this is it," she said, and her voice came out low and shaking, worse somehow than a scream would have been. "This is where you go every night. This is what you leave our bed for."
Elias spun toward her, his face draining of all color, stammering some broken beginning of an excuse that died before it ever properly formed.
"Ruth," he managed, "it isn't I. Only came to... We were only..."
"Don't," Ruth said, and the single word cut through his stumbling worse than any shout could have. "Don't you dare stand there and lie to my face on top of everything else."
Delilah, for her part, did not so much as flinch. She stood exactly where she had been, unhurried, her expression settling into something almost like mild curiosity, as though the scene unfolding before her were a small domestic disturbance belonging to other people, nothing that touched her at all.
"You ought not to have come creeping around at this hour," Delilah said softly, her voice carrying none of the alarm the moment surely called for. "A wife oughtn't spy on her husband so." Something in Ruth broke loose at those words, some final restraint giving way all at once, and she crossed the room in 3 quick strides, meaning only, she would later tell herself, to strike the girl, to make her feel some small fraction of the pain now tearing through her own chest. Her hand closed hard around Delilah's forearm and froze there. Beneath her fingers, the flesh she gripped was cold. Not merely cool, not the ordinary chill of a body that ran naturally cold-blooded, but a deep, settled cold that seemed to reach up through her palm and into her wrist. The particular terrible cold of something that had not held its own warmth in a very long time. It was, Ruth would think later in the sleepless hours that followed, exactly the cold of the stone slabs Elias carved his lettering into, the cold of something that had never truly been alive at all, or had stopped being so long ago. She snatched her hand back with a small, strangled cry, staggering a step away, and in that same instant, the lamp guttered and went out entirely, plunging the room into sudden blackness. Elias called her name, his voice cracking with something that might have been fear, reaching blindly toward where she had stood. But Ruth was already moving, already stumbling back through the dark doorway and out into the cool night air, her chest heaving, her mind refusing entirely to make sense of what her own hand had just told her. "Don't touch me," she said, when his fingers finally found her arm outside on the wet grass. "Don't you dare touch me. Not ever again." She turned and fled across the yard back into their own dark house and threw the bolt behind her with hands that would not stop shaking. She did not weep, not then. The tears would come later, in private, in the long, hollow hours before dawn. In that first moment, there was only a cold, stunned silence settling over her deeper and stranger than any grief she had yet known, as though some door in the ordinary world had swung open just wide enough to show her a glimpse of something on the other side that she had no words for, and no way now to close again. She sat alone at the kitchen table through what remained of the night, the shawl drawn tight around her shoulders, listening for the sound of the door, for Elias's footsteps returning. But he did not come, not for a long while. And when at last she did hear him on the porch steps, moving slow and uncertain, she did not rise to meet him. She sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the cold hearth, and let him find her there in his own time, already understanding in some deep and wordless place that whatever they had built together in that house was not going to survive what she had just seen. The house changed after that night, in ways no carpenter could have named or repaired. It was the same 4 walls, the same tin roof, the same low ceiling Elias had once lain beneath, dreaming of a family that would fill it. And yet, It felt now like a different house entirely, cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. Ruth did not rage at him again, not after that first terrible night. She did not weep where he could see her, did not curse him, did not throw his clothes out into the yard the way another woman might have. She simply withdrew quietly and completely into some private country of her own where he was no longer welcome. And the silence she carried was worse, far worse than any amount of shouting could have been.
She still rose early and kept the house. She still cooked, though the meals came smaller now and colder, set down on the table without a word and eaten the same way. She still went to church each Sunday, walking the 1.5 miles alone now, since Elias had taken to finding excuses to stay behind, unable to sit in that small white room beside her and feel Brother Amos's eyes and God's resting on the both of them.
He tried in the first days to make some amends. He offered soft words in the evenings, reached for her hand across the table, told her plainly that he was sorry that it had been a moment of foolish weakness and nothing more, that he loved her still and always would. Ruth only looked at him each time with the same flat, exhausted patience, the look of a woman who has already heard every word a man might say and found none of them equal to what he had done. Once, early on, he tried to explain himself further, some tangled, half-formed account of loneliness and temptation, and she cut him off before he had gotten more than a few words in.
"I don't want your sorry," she told him once, the only time she spoke more than a few clipped words to him in that whole stretch of days.
"I want you to have never done it. Since you can't give me that, I don't much see what good sorry is going to do either one of us." After that, he stopped trying. It was easier, he found, to let the silence stand, to let the days pass one into the next, with only the necessary words exchanged between them, than to keep offering apologies that landed each time like stones dropped into still water, sinking without ever once reaching her. He began drinking not long after. It started small, a single glass of the sharp homemade liquor a neighbor down the hollow traded him for a headstone taken alone on the porch after Ruth had gone into bed. One glass to help him sleep, he told himself. But one glass became two, and two became most of the bottle, and within a few weeks he found he could not properly settle into an evening at all without the slow, dulling warmth of it spreading through his chest,
blunting whatever else waited there to be felt. It did help in its way. It softened the memory of Ruth's cold, wounded eyes. It softened too, though he would not have admitted this even to himself, the ache of no longer having Delilah near him each evening, for she had not come again to the house since that night. And some new and reckless part of him had begun in the deep hours when the liquor loosened his thinking to resent his own wife for the absence, as though the fault of it lay somehow with her rather than with him. He had gone to the fence once or twice in the first days, hoping to catch some glimpse of Delilah in her yard. But the house next door had gone as dark and still as it had been all through that first long month of August before the rain, before any of it had begun. And he did not dare cross over uninvited, while Ruth might still be watching from the window. It was on one such night, sitting alone on the dark porch, with the bottle gone down near empty beside him, that the first shape of the thought came to him. It arrived quietly, the way such thoughts often do, not as a decision, but as a mere idle wondering, the kind of thing a man's mind will produce and set aside, without meaning anything serious by it. He thought of Ruth's slow, careful silence, her refusal to forgive him, her steady, patient unwillingness to simply let the matter go and return things to how they had been. He thought of Delilah, of her cool hands and her patient waiting eyes, and of how easily, how completely everything might be set right again if only there were no wife left standing between them. He tried at first to push the thought away, ashamed even to have let it surface at all. But it did not stay pushed away for long. It returned the following night, and the night after that, each time a little less shocking, a little more familiar, coiling itself down deep in some dark corner of him, like a serpent settling into a den it had already decided to keep. By the time the bottle was empty that third night,
and Elias sat staring out at the black shape of the mountains against the darker sky. The thought had stopped feeling like a stranger in his mind at all. It sat there instead, patient and cold, waiting only for the right moment, the right road, the right turn to become something more than a thought. The day it happened, the sky hung white and cloudless, the kind of relentless late summer heat that pressed down on the hollow like a hand held flat against the back of the neck. Elias had a delivery to make, a set of finished markers bound for a family on the far side of the ridge, and Ruth rode along in the truck bed among the crates as she sometimes did on such trips, glad enough of the excuse to get out of the house for an hour, even in silence. Even seated apart from him, with her eyes fixed on the passing trees rather than on her husband's face. The road climbed and wound the way it always did, red clay giving way to broken shale, the truck laboring up each grade with the same tired complaint it always made. Elias knew every foot of that road by heart by then. Every rut, every washed-out shoulder, every blind curve where the mountain fell away sharp on one side into a dry, rock-strewn creek bed some 30 feet below. He had thought of the curve before. He would not in the days that followed be able to say exactly when the idle, half-formed notion, sitting coiled in the back of his mind, had hardened into something closer to a plan. But somewhere in the drinking, in the long, silent evenings on the porch, his thoughts had settled again and again on that particular bend in the road. The one place along the whole route where a truck losing its grip on the gravel might plausibly, might understandably go over the edge. He had driven past it a dozen times since without incident, watching the drop each time out of the corner of his eye, turning the shape of the thing over in his mind the way a man turns a stone over in his pocket, not yet ready to throw it, not yet willing to put it down either. He glanced in the mirror. Ruth sat with her back against a crate, her face turned toward the passing trees, her hands folded loose in her lap, entirely unaware, entirely trusting, exactly as she had been every single day of their marriage, exactly as she had been on that first night in the rented room in town when she had asked him how long before they moved up to the hollow. His hands tightened on the wheel. He told himself even then, in that last handful of seconds, that he could still choose otherwise. That there was still a version of that afternoon where the truck simply carried them both safely down the mountain and nothing more happened than the delivery of a few finished stones. He told himself this, even as his foot pressed down harder on the gas than the grade required, even as the truck's rear wheels found the loose gravel shoulder just where the road bent sharp around the curve. The wheel jerked hard beneath his hands. He did not fight it. The truck's back end swung wide, caught the crumbling edge of the shoulder, and the whole vehicle tipped sideways with a groan of metal that seemed for one endless instant to hang suspended in the hot, still air before gravity took hold of it entirely. Elias felt his own body thrown against the door, felt his hand find the handle, and the ground rushing up cool and hard beneath him as he threw himself clear. Some old animal instinct carrying him out of the cab a half second before it mattered most. He hit the ground and rolled, the breath knocked clean out of him. And behind him, he heard the truck go over a long, grinding crash of metal and splintering wood as it tumbled down into the dry creek bed. The crates of stone breaking loose and scattering, and somewhere in the middle of all that noise, one sound, distinct from the rest, sharp and terrible, and gone almost before he could be certain he had heard it at all. For a long moment, Elias lay where he had fallen, his ears ringing, dust settling slow around him in the windless heat. And then he forced himself up onto his hands and knees and looked down into the ravine. The truck lay on its side amid the wreckage of the crates, and Ruth lay some distance from it, thrown clear in the fall, entirely still among the scattered stone. He scrambled down the slope on legs that did not feel entirely his own. His hands and knees scraped raw against the rock, and when he reached her, he already knew, before he had even fully knelt at her side, that whatever prayer might have still lived somewhere in him had come too late. He knelt there a long moment in the white, relentless heat, looking down at what his own choice had made of her, and felt moving through him in slow, confusing waves, a grief that was entirely real, and a strange, hollow relief that was somehow just as real beside it. The two feelings tangled together so completely that he could not afterward have said which one arrived first or which one he was more ashamed of.
Then, because there was nothing else left to do, because the world would soon come looking for an explanation, and he had already decided weeks before in the slow poison of those drinking evenings exactly what explanation he meant to give, Elias threw back his head and began to scream for help, the sound tearing raw out of his throat and echoing off into the empty hills, over and over, the same two words, again and again, until his voice broke.
Accident! Accident! Somebody help me, it was an accident!
It was a passing lumber truck that found him, some 20 minutes, on the driver a heavy-set man named Curtis, who had made that same mountain run twice a week for the better part of a decade, and knew the treacherous nature of that particular curve better than most. He pulled over at the sight of Elias standing in the middle of the road, blood dried dark on his forearms, his voice worn down to a hoarse, broken thing, and understood the situation well before Elias had managed to force out more than a few garbled words.
They went over. Elias kept saying, pointing back down the slope with a hand that would not hold steady. My wife. The truck went over. I couldn't. I tried to. I couldn't get to her in time.
Curtis scrambled down into the ravine himself and came back up a few minutes later with his face gone gray and grim, shaking his head slow, and did not need to say the words out loud for Elias to understand that the man had confirmed what he already knew.
Word traveled fast after that, the way it always did in a place as small and close-knit as the Hollow. Within the hour, there were 3 more trucks pulled off at the roadside, men climbing down into the creek bed to help however they could, though there was little enough left to do by then, but wait for the county sheriff to make the long drive up from town.
The sheriff was a slow, deliberate man named Foss Gray at the Temples, who had seen enough mountain roads claim enough lives over the years that the scene before him seemed to trouble him little beyond the ordinary weariness of a hard job. He walked the length of the skid marks twice, noted the loose gravel on the shoulder, examined the angle of the drop, and questioned Elias only briefly, his manner more sympathetic than suspicious, jotting a few short lines in a battered notebook he kept tucked inside his breast pocket.
Roads up here'll do this to a man, Foss said, shaking his head as he closed his little notebook. Especially in this heat. Road gets slick with dust, same as it would with rain. Had 2 others go off this same stretch in the last 5 years. County keeps saying they'll put up a rail along here, and they never do. You're lucky you got clear yourself. A lot of men wouldn't have. Elias standing there with his scraped arms bound in strips of cloth someone had torn from a spare shirt, could only nod, unable to trust his own voice with anything more than the barest agreement. No one asked him why he had been driving faster than the grade required. No one asked why a man so familiar with that curve, a man who had driven it 100 times without incident, would suddenly lose control of it now. The explanation offered itself so plainly, so naturally, that no one in the whole gathered crowd of neighbors and lawmen thought to look for any other one at all. By the time the sun had begun sinking low and orange behind the ridgeline, the worst of the practical business had been seen to. Ruth had been carried up out of the ravine and taken down to the funeral parlor in town, the wreckage of the truck left where it lay for now, and Elias stood alone at last in the gathering dusk. The crowd finally thinned away, the road gone quiet again. He looked down once more into the ravine, at the dark stain on the pale rock where she had lain, and felt, standing there in the fading light, an emptiness so total and so strange that it frightened him more than any grief he might have expected to feel. He had imagined in the slow poison of those drinking nights that her absence would come as a relief, a clearing of the path toward whatever he believed waited for him with Delilah. Instead, it came as a hollowness, vast and cold, a silence where her voice,
Her small, steady presence had always been. And he found himself for one dizzying moment, almost wishing he could take the whole afternoon back and live it over some other way. Brother Amos found him there not long after having heard the news and walked the long road up from the church without waiting to be asked. He said little at first, only stood beside Elias in the fading light with one broad hand resting heavy and steady on his shoulder.
"The Lord don't promise us an easy road, son,"
Amos said finally, his voice low and grave. "Only that he walks it with us. Whatever guilt a man carries after a thing like this, whatever he blames himself for not seeing, not stopping, the Lord's mercy runs deeper than any of it. If a man's willing to lay it down before him, honest." Elias said nothing, staring down into the darkening ravine, the words landing somewhere in him that he did not yet have the courage to examine.
"We'll see her laid to rest, proper,"
Amos went on. "Day after tomorrow, if that suits. The whole hollow will turn out for her. She was well loved here, Elias, in the short time we had her." Elias nodded, unable to trust himself with words. And together, the two men began the slow walk back down the darkening road toward the house, toward the 2 long days that stood now between him and the funeral, and toward whatever waited for him on the far side of it. They buried Ruth 2 days later, on a still gray morning that seemed, in its quiet and its heaviness, entirely fitting for what the day required. The service was held first at the house, the plain pine coffin set on trestles in the front room, where Ruth had once knelt each morning to pray, the whole hollow turning out in a slow, steady stream to pay their respects, exactly as Brother Amos had promised they would. Elias stood beside the coffin through the long hours of the viewing, dressed in his one good suit, his face arranged into the careful shape of grief, accepting the murmured condolences of neighbors he barely knew with a nod, a handshake, a low word of thanks. It was, in its way, the hardest performance he had ever given, though performance was not a word he would have allowed himself to use, even in the privacy of his own thoughts. He wept when weeping seemed called for. He accepted comfort when comfort was offered. He played the part of the grieving widower so completely that by the second hour, he had very nearly convinced himself of it too. He heard the whispers all the same, low and careful, the way such things always traveled in a small place like the Hollow. Married not but a few months, poor girl. Barely had time to settle into that house before the Lord called her home. Terrible thing, terrible thing. A young couple with the whole world ahead of them. No one, so far as Elias could tell, whispered anything darker than sympathy. Miss Hetty came dressed in severe black and pressed his hand between both of hers with a strength that startled him. "You take care now," she said, her pale eyes searching his face a moment too long for comfort. "Grief does strange things to a man up here especially. Don't let it lead you anywhere you oughtn't go. There's things in these hills that know a wounded man when they see one, and they don't always mean him well, whatever comfort they might seem to offer at first." He thanked her for the kindness and said nothing more, uncertain whether her words carried any particular weight beyond the ordinary, or whether some part of her, some old, careful instinct, honed over years of watching this hollow and its troubles, sensed something in him that the rest of the gathered mourners did not. The burial itself took place that afternoon in the small churchyard behind the white chapel, the coffin lowered by rope into ground that had been broken only that morning. Brother Amos reading over it in his low, steady voice, words of resurrection and mercy that seemed to Elias, standing there with his head properly bowed, to land somewhere far outside himself, as though they were being spoken to another man entirely. It was as the last shovelful of earth was being turned that the dog appeared. It came trotting up out of the tree line at the edge of the churchyard, the same black hound that had burst into the house weeks before, its coat still matted, its ribs still showing plain beneath the fur. It stopped some yards off from the gathered mourners, planted its feet, and began to bark high and frantic, its whole body rigid, its eyes fixed once again with that same raw, unreasoning terror. Though this time, the animal's gaze had shifted from the space Delilah once occupied to Elias himself, standing at the graveside in his black suit. A few of the mourners glanced over, startled, but the animal did not approach, only stood at the tree line, barking its ragged warning until one of the men shooed it off with a thrown stone, and it vanished back into the brush as quickly as it had come. No one remarked on it further. It was, after all, only a stray dog, the kind of half-wild creature that wandered these hills in packs, drawn sometimes to the smell of fresh-turned earth. Only Elias understood, standing there with cold sweat gathering beneath his collar, exactly what the animal had been trying to say, and to whom. By the time the last of the mourners had gone, the sun already sinking low behind the ridge, Elias found himself alone at last in the empty house. The borrowed chairs still arranged in rows in the front room, the smell of lilies and turned earth still clinging faintly to his good suit. He poured himself a glass of the sharp liquor, sat down at the kitchen table, and for a long moment simply stared at nothing at all. Then slowly something shifted in his face. The careful mask of grief he had worn all through that long, exhausting day began in the privacy of the empty house to slip loose and fall away entirely, and in its place, there rose an expression Elias himself would not have recognized had he thought to look in a mirror just then. A thin, cold smile, touching only the corners of his mouth. The expression of a man who has stepped through some final dark doorway and found on the other side of it nothing left to fear. "She's gone now," he murmured to the empty room, his voice low and strange in his own ears. "Nothing left standing between us. Nobody left to stop us now." He set down the glass, still half full, and rose from the table. And before he had fully decided to do it, his feet were already carrying him out through the door and across the darkening yard, toward the gap in the fence, toward the small, silent house where he had not set foot since the night everything had first begun to unravel. The house next door stood dark when he reached it, as it always did, but the door gave easily beneath his hand, unlatched as though she had known he would come and left it so on purpose. He crossed the threshold into a blackness so complete he could see nothing at all, only feel his way forward by memory and instinct, past the front room and toward the narrow doorway that led back to where she slept. "Delilah," he said softly, his voice unsteady in the dark. "Delilah, are you here?" A shape stirred on the bed ahead of him, pale even in the near total darkness, her hair loose and spread across the pillow. And though he could not clearly see her face, he heard her voice, low and unhurried, exactly as it always was. "I knew you'd come," she said. "I've been waiting." He crossed the small room and knelt beside the bed, his voice breaking as the words finally came loose from wherever he had been holding them these past weeks. "I couldn't bear it any longer," he said. "Watching that empty house, grieving something I can't even say I truly wanted the way I was supposed to. You're the only thing left that makes any of it feel bearable." "Then don't wait any longer," Delilah said, and reached for him in the dark, her hand finding his with unerring certainty despite the blackness, cool and slender against his own trembling fingers. What followed passed in a blur he would not afterward be able to properly separate into ordered moments, only a confusion of sensation, want, and grief and guilt, all tangled together into something he no longer had the strength to resist or examine. He gave himself over to it entirely. The long weeks of watching and wanting finally answered. And for a while, a short, merciful while, every dark thing that had brought him to this room fell away from him completely. It was in the midst of that surrender that he felt it, something wrong beneath his mouth, small and yielding and utterly out of place, a texture that had no business belonging to living flesh, soft and slack in a way that made his stomach lurch even before his mind had caught up to what his body was telling him. He drew back sharply, choking a foul, coppery taste flooding his mouth,
thick and rotten, and when he spat into his own hand in the dark, some small, dense thing landed there, wet and cold. He could not see it. He did not need to see it to know with the horror that seized his whole chest at once that what lay in his palm was shaped nothing like anything that ought to be inside a living mouth. His fingers, moving almost against his own will, found an edge to it in the dark, small and firm at one end, and he understood with a lurch of pure animal revulsion that he was holding something that had once, somewhere, belonged to a person. Elias scrambled backward off the bed with a strangled cry, knocking the small bedside table over in his panic, and lunged for the wall where he remembered from that first terrible night the light switch had been. His hand found it, fumbling, and the room flooded suddenly with the sickly yellow glow of a bare bulb overhead. He spun back toward the bed, his chest heaving, his stomach still roiling with that foul taste, ready to see whatever horror his own hand had just confirmed. The bed was empty, not disturbed, not vacated in haste. Simply empty, the blanket lying smooth and undisturbed, exactly as it might have lain in a room that had never been slept in at all. No shape beneath it, no warmth left in the sheets. Elias stood frozen, his hand still curled tight around whatever he had spat into it, afraid now even to open his fingers and look. "What is it?" Delilah's voice asked from the doorway behind him, and he spun to find her standing there fully clothed, her expression mild, faintly puzzled, as though she had only just come in from another room entirely and found him in some inexplicable fit. He forced his hand open. There was nothing in it. No matter how he turned, his palm tilted it toward the light, searched every crease of his own skin. There was nothing there at all. No trace of whatever cold, wrong thing he had felt land in his hand only moments before. The rotten taste still clung thick at the back of his throat, sour and undeniable. No matter how firmly his eyes now insisted, the room held nothing to explain it. The whiskey, he thought, desperately grasping for anything that might restore some order to the world. "It's the drink. I've had too much. My mind's playing tricks. That's all this is." "Turn off the light," Delilah said softly, crossing toward him in the harsh glow of the bare bulb. "I don't care for it. Come back to bed, Elias. You're only frightening yourself over nothing." He nodded, though his hands would not fully stop their trembling, and flipped the switch, plunging the room back into merciful darkness, telling himself, with the last desperate scraps of reason he had left, that the whiskey alone could account for everything his own senses had just insisted was real. He let her draw him back down onto the bed, her cool hand steady against his chest, and though some small, frightened part of him wanted badly to flee that house and never return, the larger, hungrier part of him, the part that had already sacrificed so much to be here, would not let him rise again. He lay back down beside her in the dark, his heart still hammering, telling himself over and over that the whiskey alone had conjured the horror he thought he'd felt. Delilah drew close against him once more, her cool hand resting flat against his chest. And for a while, the darkness held only the ordinary quiet of two bodies settling towards sleep. Then beneath his palm, resting against her shoulder, Elias felt the skin shift, not the way skin ought to shift, warm and pliant beneath a light touch, but loose somehow, unmoored from whatever lay beneath it, the way wet paper will slide free of a wall that was never properly pasted to. He froze his hand, still resting there, unwilling at first to trust what his fingers were telling him. And then, in the absolute blackness of that room, he felt it give way entirely. A whole soft sheet of it peeling loose beneath his palm with a faint, wet sound he would hear again in his worst nightmares for the rest of his life, however short that life was destined to be. Beneath it, where smooth shoulders should have been, his fingers found something raw and yielding, already beginning, even as he touched it, to come apart in ragged, crumbling pieces. Elias screamed and tried to wrench himself backward, but something held his arm fast. An unnatural strength gripping his wrist, even as the rest of the body beneath him seemed to be actively dissolving. And in the dark, close enough now that he could feel breath, or something like breath, against his face, he heard the shape of a laugh, low and wet and utterly without warmth.
He clawed himself free at last and stumbled backward off the bed, hitting the wall hard enough to knock the air from his lungs. And this time, he did not hesitate, did not think twice about the light. He found the switch and threw it, flooding the room once more in that sickly yellow glow, bracing himself against the wall, gasping.
What lay on the bed no longer resembled anything that had ever drawn breath. A vast section of pale, ruined flesh had sloughed away entirely from one side, exposing something dark and wrong beneath. Already collapsing in on itself, even as Elias watched, frozen, unable to look away, and equally unable to bear looking any longer. The face he had come to know, the quiet, patient face that had haunted his every waking thought for weeks, folded inward with a soft, awful collapse. And in the space of a few unbearable seconds, the whole form on the bed had settled, sagged, and finally given way entirely, leaving behind only a scattering of bone, yellowed and old, arranged in the loose shape of a body that had once long ago been a young woman.
A skull lay tilted against the pillow where her head had rested. The empty sockets angled just slightly toward him, as though even now, even reduced to this, some fragment of her attention had not entirely let him go. Elias did not remember crossing the room. He did not remember reaching the door, or crossing the dark yard, or stumbling back into his own house and dropping the bolt with hands that shook too violently to properly manage the latch on the first 3 attempts. He remembered only afterward, sitting curled against the inside of his own front door, his whole body racked with a shaking he could not stop. The taste of rot still thick in his mouth, and the image of that half-fallen skull burned so completely into the back of his eyes that he could see it even with them squeezed shut. Somewhere in the long black hours that followed, he found himself praying for the first time in longer than he could rightly remember, though the words that came were not the ones Brother Amos had taught him, only a raw, wordless begging that whatever waited on the other side of that fence would leave him be until morning. He did not sleep again that night, though the hours crawled past him. Slow and merciless gray light finally creeping in around the edges of the shuttered windows. Somewhere near dawn, he found the strength to rise and splash cold water on his face, and caught in the small, cracked mirror above the basin a glimpse of his own reflection that startled him nearly as badly as the night's horrors had. Gaunt and hollow-eyed, a man who looked to have aged a decade in the course of a single night.
There was cruelly no room in the day ahead for whatever unraveling he might have wished to indulge in. Brother Amos had arranged days before for a small memorial gathering at the church that very morning, a final chance for the Hollow to sit together in prayer and remember Ruth properly before the ordinary business of living resumed around them. And Elias, whatever horror still clung wet and cold to the inside of his skull, understood that he was expected to be there, seated in the front pew, playing still, God help him, the part of the grieving husband, with no earthly excuse he could offer that would not raise more questions than it answered. He dressed himself with hands that had not fully stopped trembling, and walked the long 1.5 miles down to the little white church at the crossroads, the morning air cool and ordinary around him, the birds singing as though the whole world had not, in fact, quietly and irrevocably come apart in the dark hours just past. The service passed for Elias in a kind of gray fog, Brother Amos's words washing over him without quite landing. The small congregation's murmured hymns reaching his ears as though from a great distance. He sat in the front pew as expected,
nodded where nodding seemed called for, and felt the whole while as though some part of him were still standing in that ruined bedroom, staring down at a scattering of yellowed bone.
It was only after the service out on the church steps in the pale morning light that the ground truly opened beneath him. A man named Del Pruitt, an old acquaintance from Elias's stone-cutting trade, who lived over on the far side of the ridge and had come down special for Ruth's memorial, caught his arm as the crowd began to thin, offering the kind of easy, well-meant condolences a man offers another man he does not know well, but respects all the same.
Terrible thing, Del said, shaking his head.
Whole Hollows had a hard summer of it, losing your Ruth and the Mabry girl gone not 2 months before her. Seems like death's had its eye on this place lately.
Elias went very still.
The Mabry girl, he repeated, his voice coming out strange and thin.
Delilah Mabry, Del said.
Silas Mabry's only daughter lives over past the store. You'd have heard surely being so close by. Terrible wreck out on the county road back in June it must have been. Car went head-on with a coal truck at that switchback they call Miller's Curve. Poor thing, they say there wasn't hardly enough left of her to know her by her own face. Buried her the 28th, I recall, on account of my cousin's boy standing as one of the pallbearers. The world seemed to tilt beneath Elias's feet, the church steps, the pale morning sky, the gathered mourners, all sliding sideways for one dizzying instant before he managed to catch himself against the porch rail.
The 28th, he said, his voice barely a whisper. That was noon. They buried her at noon. Queer thing about it, too, now you mention it.
Del went on, oblivious to the color draining entirely from Elias's face. No bells, no proper hymn, nothing. Her daddy insisted on it being done quiet, middle of the day, on account of some old family custom about a life cut short, needing to go into the ground before the sun turned past its highest point. Struck most folks as strange, but grief does strange things to a man's notions. Pretty thing too, by all accounts, though I never met her myself.
My cousin's boy said folks over that way used to say it was near a shame a girl that fine-looking never getting the chance to marry, never getting the chance at much of anything at all. Elias could not have said afterward how he managed to thank Del for the news, or how he found his own legs carrying him away from the church steps and out onto the road, his mind reeling backward through every single evening of the past 2 months, every cool touch, every patient smile, every soft word spoken in the dark. Delilah Mabry, 19 years old, dead since the 28th of June, buried at noon in a coffin of pale, unfinished pine on the very same road at the very same hour that Elias himself had first laid eyes on her. He walked or stumbled the whole long way to the Mabry place without any clear memory of deciding to go there, his body carrying him forward on some instinct that had bypassed his reeling mind entirely. The house, when he reached it, sat small and neat behind a low picket fence, and Silas Mabry himself, a stooped gray man with the particular hollowed look of a father who has buried his only child, answered the door with weary confusion at the sight of a stranger standing wild-eyed on his porch. "Can I help you, son?" Silas asked.
And Elias, unable to form any proper introduction, could only ask in a voice that did not sound entirely like his own, whether he might come in.
Silas led him out of some old habit of country hospitality that not even grief could fully erase, into a modest front room. And it was there, on a small table set against the far wall, draped still in black ribbon, that Elias saw it. A framed photograph. A young woman with dark hair and a soft, quiet mouth, her eyes holding the particular stillness of someone who had learned even in life to watch a room more than she spoke in it. Elias's knees very nearly gave out beneath him. It was her face. The exact face that had haunted the photograph carried at the head of that terrible procession. The exact face that had turned to look at him from the road, wide-eyed and reaching all those weeks before. The exact face he had held in his own hands, kissed in the dark, and watched only hours ago come apart into bone. Beneath the photograph, a small brass plate read simply, Delilah Ann Mabry, born 1960,
Taken Home, 1980.
Elias stood frozen before it, the whole terrible shape of the truth finally fully assembling itself in his mind, every cruel piece of it locking into place at once. The lips he had kissed, the lie he had told himself was only whiskey and nerves, the cold hand that had gripped his own so surely in the dark. And somewhere behind him, he heard Silas Mabry's voice, gentle and confused, asking again if the young man was quite all right, if perhaps he ought to sit down a moment.
Elias did not answer. He was no longer entirely certain he could. Silas Mabry stepped closer, his weathered face creased with real concern now, his hand half raised as though to steady the wild-eyed stranger swaying in his front room.
"Son," he said again, gentler this time, "you'd best sit down. You've gone white as a sheet."
Elias could not sit.
He could not in that moment do anything at all beyond staring at the small brass plate beneath the photograph, the words burning themselves into him, letter by letter. Born 1960. Taken Home 1980. A girl he had held in his arms not 12 hours before. A girl whose cool hand had drawn him down into a bed that by every plain fact now standing before him ought to have been empty for 2 long months.
"I'm sorry," he managed, at last the words scraping raw out of his throat. "I have to go." He did not wait for Silas Mabry to respond. He turned and stumbled back out through the front door, down the porch steps, and out onto the road, his legs carrying him forward with no clear destination beyond the desperate need to put distance between himself and that small, terrible photograph. He half walked, half ran the whole long way back to the hollow, his mind refusing even now to settle fully into the shape of what he understood to be true. There had to be some other explanation, some mistake. A resemblance, however uncanny, however impossible, was still only a resemblance. And men's minds, especially minds worn thin by grief and drink and guilt, were known to conjure all manner of foolishness. He thought of Miss Hetty's warning weeks before on that first terrible noon. Talk sweet on a soul like that, and she'll hear you. She'll remember your face. He had laughed the words off then, certain of his own good sense. He was not laughing now. He told himself this all the way home and stopped believing it entirely the moment he came within sight of the house next door. The place stood exactly as it had that very first evening, weeks before, when Ruth had first pointed it out to him through the Range Street window. Boards nailed fast across every window, gray and weathered as though they had been there for years uncounted. Blackberry canes grown thick and wild over the porch steps, untouched, undisturbed, exactly as they had lain all through August before Delilah had ever supposedly moved in. No door stood ajar to welcome him. No lamp had ever, in truth, been lit behind those boarded windows. There was no sign anywhere on that porch or in that overgrown yard that a living soul had set foot there in years. And Elias understood with a fresh wave of horror that he had crossed that fence and sat in that front room a dozen times or more without ever once truly seeing the ruin he was walking into. Elias stood frozen at the fence line, his breath coming in short, ragged pulls, staring at a house that had, by every physical evidence before him, been standing empty the entire time. Then from somewhere within that dark boarded structure, a sound reached him. Soft laughter, low and wet, drifting out through some gap he could not locate, carrying with it the same cold, patient amusement he had heard whispered against his ear only hours before, in the moment the bed beneath him had finally given up its secret. The front door, boarded shut a moment before, or so he would have sworn on his own life, stood suddenly open, black and gaping. And in the depth of that darkness, a shape began slowly to take form. It was Delilah, and it was not. The face held the same features he had come to know, the same dark eyes, the same soft mouth, but the skin now hung loose and gray across bone that showed plain beneath it in places.
and where her eyes should have held their familiar, quiet patience, there was only a flat, milky white, exactly as they had been that first terrible noon on the road. She raised one pale, ruined hand toward him, fingers curling slow through the air, beckoning. And her mouth opened in something that might once have been a smile.
"Come back, Elias," she said, her voice carrying that same low, unhurried cadence, though something beneath it now scraped and rattled as though the words were being dragged up from somewhere far deeper than a living throat could reach. "You gave up everything for me. You can't turn back now." Elias screamed, a raw, wordless sound, tearing loose from somewhere deep in his chest, and turned and ran, stumbling across the yard, past his own dark house, out onto the road itself, his mind gone entirely, past reason, past prayer, past anything but the single animal need to put as much distance as possible between himself and that reaching gray hand. He did not choose the direction he ran in. His feet simply carried him blind and desperate, back the way he had come that terrible afternoon, weeks before, up the winding mountain road toward the one place in all the hollow that his body seemed to remember better than any other. The one place he had thought in his cold and calculated planning would put an end to all his trouble, rather than mark the true beginning of it. Toward the curve. Elias reached the curve as the light was beginning to fail, the sky gone the deep bruised purple of early evening. The same dry creek bed waiting far below, exactly as it had that terrible afternoon. He stumbled to a halt at the edge of the road, his chest heaving, his legs finally giving out beneath him. And there, in the gathering dark, he found he was no longer alone. Ruth stood at the center of the road, just where the gravel shoulder began to crumble away toward the drop. She looked at first glance exactly as she had in life, her hair loose around her shoulders, her plain white dress catching what little light remained in the sky. But as Elias's eyes adjusted to the dusk, he saw the wrongness of her too. The way her head sat tilted at an angle no living neck could hold. The dark stain still spread across the front of her dress, the eyes that fixed on him now with none of the warmth he remembered, only a vast, patient sorrow that seemed to reach down into the very center of him. "Elias," she said, and her voice, though changed, was still unmistakably her own. "Why?" He fell to his knees on the gravel, sobbing, all the poison of the past months finally breaking loose from him at once. "I'm sorry," he said the words, tearing out of him raw and broken. "God forgive me, Ruth. I'm sorry. I never meant. I don't know what I let myself become. You were good to me. You were always good to me, and I threw it all away for a thing that was never even truly alive to want back." She did not move toward him, and she did not move away. She only stood watching him with that same terrible, sorrowful patience, until behind her, rising slow out of the tree line, a second shape appeared, pale and gray. And Elias understood, with the last clear thought his unraveling mind would ever produce, that Delilah had followed him too. What happened next, no living witness could ever fully account for. The two shapes seemed for one impossible instant to merge into a single pale blur, and a sound rose up out of that merging, unlike anything Elias had ever heard. A keening, grieving wail that was at once his wife's voice and a stranger's, calling his name over and over as the ground itself seemed to tilt beneath him. He stumbled backward, his foot finding nothing but air where the shoulder had crumbled away. And for one endless second, he hung suspended over the same dark drop he had once sent his wife falling into, before gravity, patient and impartial, finally claimed its due. They found him the next morning, broken on the same rocks that had taken Ruth, his eyes open and fixed on the sky, his lips still moving faintly, though no one standing over him could make out any words in it at all. There is an old truth, older than any single sorrow, that the wrong we bury does not stay buried. It rises again in its own season, in its own shape, and asks of us the one thing we can never fully give back once it is taken. Elias Crane wanted a home, a name, a life built with his own two hands, and for a while, God granted him exactly that. What he built upon it after, no earthly blessing could shelter him from, and no amount of wanting things to be otherwise could undo the choice he made in the space of a single reckless afternoon. Temptation rarely announces itself plainly. It comes instead in quiet, patient forms, wearing whatever face a man's own hunger has already prepared him to welcome. Ruth Crane had asked for very little in this life. Only a roof of her own, a husband who loved her plainly, and a quiet corner of the world to call home. She never lived to see whether the Lord would have granted her more, but those who knew her best believed and still believe that her faith carried her somewhere far kinder than the hollow that took her, and that in His mercy she was finally fully at rest beyond the reach of any further sorrow this world might have asked her to bear. If this story found its way to your heart tonight, I hope you'll carry a piece of it with you, not as a warning against love, but as a reminder of what we owe the ones who stay faithful to us in the dark. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if these stories mean something to you, consider staying a while longer. There are more waiting to be told. To this day, folks in that part of the mountains say a body driving alone past that curve late in the evening will sometimes hear two voices carried faint on the wind. A woman weeping soft and low, and a man's voice, choked and broken, calling out again and again for a forgiveness that never quite seems to reach him. Whether that forgiveness ever comes, no one left living can rightly say. And perhaps that, more than any other part of this story, is the one true mercy left for the rest of us to hold on to. That our own choices, however small they seem in the moment we make them, are never quite as hidden as we hope.